Welcome to Autism Knows No Borders, a podcast where people connected to autism inspire change and build community. Together with the Global Autism Project, I'm your host, Rachel Harmon, a professional with over a decade of experience in the field of autism services, outreach, and advocacy. What are considered the gold standard tools for diagnosing autism? If you're curious about the history of autism diagnoses and observational assessments, you'll want to listen to this episode with Dr. Catherine Lord. Dr. Lord is an American psychologist and researcher. She currently serves as a member of the International Advisory Board for the Lance Psychiatry, a co-chair of the Scientific Research Council of the Child Mind Institute, and the George Tarjan Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry and Education at UCLA's Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior. Credited for co-developing the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, or ADOS for short, and the Autism Diagnostic Interview-Revised, ADIR, Dr. Lord is also known for leading one of the largest and longest-running longitudinal studies of autism in modern research, which began in 1990 and continues to follow a community sample of over 200 individuals. Dr. Lord has authored numerous books about autism and hundreds of peer-reviewed journal articles, as well as received a considerable number of awards and professional recognitions. This episode is part one of our conversation, and we discuss shortcomings of early autism diagnosis, why autism was so hard to diagnose consistently, how the ADOS assessment tool was developed, what it actually does and does not measure, common misunderstandings of the ADOS, why a diagnosis involves more than a single test, training and cultural considerations for professionals who administer the ADOS, the evolution of autism categories in the DSM and why these changes matter, how families can explain an autism diagnosis to their child, early detection in infants, misconceptions about regressive autism, and self-diagnosis and access to autism assessments. In this episode, discover what's possible when diagnosis opens doors. And now I present you Dr. Catherine Lord.
I'm Kathy Lord. I'm a professor at UCLA in psychiatry. I'm actually a clinical psychologist, and I do research and clinical work with autistic kids and adults across the lifespan.
Amazing. And it is really, truly an honor to have you on our podcast. So thank you for being here.
It's great to be here.
Okay, Kathy, and I want to start with talking about what autism diagnosis looked like when you began working in this field. Could you talk about some of the biggest gaps in autism diagnosis?
Absolutely. So when I started in this field, there were a lot of questions about how to make diagnoses. And it turned out that the diagnosis was predominantly made by sort of who was the most powerful person in a clinic, and they decided. And what's interesting is I still think we depend on clinical insight, putting all the information together. There is no one score that means you have autism or don't have autism. But at the time, there were all sorts of different diagnostic criteria and different strategies for how you meet a family or meet an autistic child at that point and how you make that decision.
And what year was this, just to give some context?
Late 1960s, early 1970s.
Okay. And so why do you think it was so difficult to identify autism consistently?
I mean, it's interesting because at that point, it actually wasn't difficult in the sense that only the most severe kids were getting identified as having autism. But I think that, when you look at the history of psychology and psychiatry, and at that point, pediatrics wasn't that involved, I think that there weren't a lot of strategies for looking at behavior. You could total things up. You could say, how many times did the child say X? But that isn't going to give you a diagnosis. So what was interesting for me was, as a psychologist and then someone who was very interested in development, like how do kids learn or not learn, or what are they learning? And how does that change over time to say, well, really, how could we do this more systematically so that you could get psychiatrists in London who was working with them there, and psychologists in North Carolina, and pediatricians in Canada to all agree this child has autism.
Mm-hmm. So, what inspired eventually the development of the ADOS?
So, in fact, Michael Rudder, who was a child psychiatrist in the UK, was doing a very big genetic study. It was the beginning of thinking that there might be something to the fact that genetics is important in autism. And he was bringing together people from all across Europe to recruit autistic kids. And he was working with Susan Folstein, who was a child psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins. And I was living in Canada, and I'd been trained by someone in North Carolina. And so I realized everyone had different diagnoses. So I think the two things that happened there was Mike Rudder was very interested in interviews. And so he, as a psychiatrist, really led us with a British psychiatrist named Anne Lakuta to create the ADI, which is the parent interview. But what happened to me as a psychologist was I was interested in interacting with the child and not just talking to the parents, although I did want to talk to parents. And the other thing that happened was the advent of video cameras and videos. And I worked in a hospital in Canada where we had a very active media department who had just bought these new videos that you could carry on your shoulder. And I was like, oh my goodness, I could teach people how to interact with this child. And we could make a video of it in all these different places in, Maryland and in London and in Denmark and in France. And then we could actually all look at the same video and say, do we think this child has autism? And I could use toys that I'd just accumulated or activities I'd accumulated, both taken from developmental psychology researchers and also from just things I'd learned to set up something where everyone did more or less the same thing with kids of different ages. So that's sort of where it started. The other thing I think is we were saying that the diagnosis of autism was shifting to looking at social reciprocity. And the idea was that a good clinician is a social being. So you could use what you were doing as a clinician to both make this fun so the child was happy while you were playing with them, but also learn what did it take from you to get this child involved with the idea that everybody could be involved, but how much did you have to help them?
Got it. So, what kinds of interactions happen during an ADOS assessment?
Well, I think we were doing, for example, we were playing with the child and just seeing what does the child do when you put down some toys in front of them, and then if you do something, will the child let you join them? What do they do if you model doing something? What do you do if they put out a bag where you're clearly going to clean up? Do they help you clean up? I mean, just ordinary kinds of behaviors. What do you do if you have a snack and you offer it to them and then you put it in containers that they can't open? Do they ask for help? Do they let you know? Do they make a choice? And do they let you know that they need help? What happens if you do something that's funny or like shoot a balloon across the room? It's initially a little scary, but can they tolerate the fact that this is weird, but then realize it's actually not going to hurt them and it's funny? And do they do something to get you to do it again? So we were really looking at this, trying to set up occasions where we weren't saying to the child, you do this, I'll do this, you do this, I'll do this, but more just having materials and activities that sort of elicited that behavior from almost any child. And that just makes it much more fun and less demanding. So you can do more things, before the child is like, okay, I'm done with you.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. So, what's the ADOS actually measuring? Can you talk about that to clarify for our listeners?
I think that the first simple thing that an ADOS does is it creates an environment for communication. So it creates a lot of very specific contexts where we know that ordinary kids do reach for something or point or gesture or say something. So we're taking a communication sample, and then for some kids, that's writing down what they say. For other kids, it might be keeping track of gestures or what do they do. I think another thing it does is it looks at shared enjoyment. So we hope that these activities are fun for kids, and we're interested in, are they fun because they're doing them with us or just fun, period? And so having a child who, takes the balloon and thinks this is pretty exciting, but doesn't realize they need you to blow it up, or they just want you to blow it up, but then they're off on their own. It also it creates context sometimes for sensory behaviors or repetitive behaviors. So there's a scratchy block and there's a string and there's something with wheels. And so we're looking at whether a child is interested in those things and reacts to them.
Got it. So, what are some, I guess, like misunderstandings about the ADOS?
I think the first misunderstanding is it is not perfect. I mean, it is, even at its very best, it works, in terms of clearly diagnosing who has autism and who doesn't at 90 or 95% of the time. But that means that 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 20 times it won't agree with our other sources of information. So we need to be very careful about it. I think a second thing is that you really do need to know how to do it. The idea is that you're not reading a manual and, ticking off what you're doing. The examiner should know enough about how to do it, and you can move things around. So if the child is starving, you can have snack at the beginning. If a child is scared of the balloon, you can do something else. So the idea is that it's as fixed as possible, but there's also a lot of flexibility in it. And it does really rely on the clinician.
Okay. Yeah. And you're part of some groups that create these instruments for diagnoses, right? And so there's like this training that's involved in the, I guess, examiner. Would they be called that?
Yeah. So I mean, we used to make the kits in my basement, and then it just got out of control. We could not keep up with the demand, and we were getting hate mail from people who said, I have to use this, I have to use this, and I couldn't make it. So we found a publisher. So the kits are made by a publisher, and we have found that you really do need to stick to the regular kit. I mean, there are cultural variations. They found out that in South Africa, we have a little squeaking frog, and that is frightening. So you could replace it with something else. But on the whole, people do need to use the kits, because if you vary something, if you bring in the child's favorite Barbie doll in the play, you're going to have a different reaction than if you have a new doll. That's something we've learned. And then there is a training that just provides it. It's not something you can just pick up if you've never seen anyone do and just do it yourself.
Mhm.
But I mean, what's amazing to me is that people with training can do a really good job. It's amazing. There are people that don't do a good job, but on the whole, I feel like it's almost the McDonald's of assessment, because if you follow the rules, it's fairly structured as long as you're a good clinician and comfortable with autistic
Okay.
adults.
Yeah. One of our partners in Ecuador, Mafra Chang, she's done the training. And so she provides the diagnoses at her center, which, for a lot of the people that we work with internationally, it's great because it makes it accessible and kind of gives parents answers. And, the diagnosis will open up so many other doors to receiving support. But is there a prerequisite of skills? You say they should be a clinician and having had experience worked with autistic people, but do they need any special credentials or anything?
No, I mean, it really isn't tied to a specific profession. I think it's easier probably for psychologists to do it because we're taught to do testing, but speech language pathologists can do it, an OT could do it, a pediatrician can do it. Mostly psychiatrists don't do it, but they're perfectly capable of doing it. So I think what you need to do, though, is just you need to see someone else do it, go to a training, and then you need to practice and have someone watch you and say, "Oh, I bet you didn't realize you're talking too fast," or, talking too much, or you missed this. And so practice numerous times. And then once you've practiced, off you go.
Got it. Hey, Rachel here. Are you enjoying this episode? Want to hear more valuable content from others you can relate with? Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you can stay up to date on future episodes. And now back to the conversation. Okay, Kathy, and I just want to bring up the topic of self diagnosis because this has come up in our podcast. And I want to hear your thoughts on if you think this is valid, for someone who would kind of do that self assessment and from there claim that they're autistic.
I mean, I worry about that a lot. I mean, obviously, I'm a clinician, so this is what I do for a living. But I think that it is understandable that someone looks up, what autism is and thinks, oh my goodness, maybe this describes me. I do think, and it's hard sometimes to then track down someone who will see you, and that gets complicated. But I do think it's worth just checking in with someone because we do see people quite frequently who think, maybe I have autism. And sometimes they absolutely do, and sometimes they don't. And
Mm,
so I think that it's worth checking with someone who just has a broader understanding of what autism is than anybody who just starts looking for themselves.
yeah, I think one of the reasons we hear, at least from some adults, is that it might not be accessible for them because of a financial issue, like going out and seeking a formal diagnosis. So, is there any workaround?
I mean, they need to figure out how to do it. I think there are people and places that will do it for minimal amounts of money. I think one of the hard things is that many of the centers that do the most comprehensive diagnoses have long waiting lists and even don't take insurance. That is really tough. And many of the families that we see in our clinic or adults have had a diagnosis from someone and then feel like I need something else. I need more information. We've been lucky because we can take insurance. And so we can get that cost down as low as possible. And I do think almost everywhere there are places. So if you contact your local autism society or Autism Speaks or go online, you can find someone who doesn't cost thousands of dollars. But I think it's hard. I mean, I know even tracking down doctors for myself, it's no, who do you trust and how do you do it? But I think also if there's some place that provides services in your community, call them and ask them or email them if you're not comfortable on the phone and ask them who would they recommend who could provide a diagnosis who is not so expensive.
Okay. Yeah, those are helpful tips. So from a family's perspective, how should parents think about labels in a helpful way, like when thinking about the importance of diagnosis?
I think that's a really good question, and it's probably different for every child in every circumstance. I think the most important thing is that it should not be shameful. I think parents should not hide this diagnosis if it's really appropriate from their child. I think it's okay, though. I mean, people do worry that a child is going to hear it and get stuck on it. And then that's gonna create other problems. So I think it's fair to be careful just to say, when is this gonna be helpful and when is it not? But I do think what overall you wanna do is not give the child any sense that you're ashamed of them or this is something that they can't talk about or they shouldn't let other people know. I think the most important thing for families is to be matter of fact about it and also just inform the child as they go along. Even if you say, you're going to meet this nice lady who is going to try to help us figure out, ways that we can work with you when things are hard. And also what are things, help us know the things you're best at so we can support those. And then you could say, there's various words you might hear about this and tell them the words, but don't get into the gory details. Later on, it's also hard because sometimes having an autism diagnosis really helps. I mean, I think for adults, it can provide a community. It can provide a sense of there are other people that have similar challenges and strengths. So that can be good. But sometimes it also, it does have still any kind of disability has a stigma. And so just deciding, is this going to be useful or not? And
Mhm.
that's not supposed to be what we're doing in medical diagnoses. We're supposed to be putting on a diagnosis that goes. I think we would always be honest with families, but I do think sometimes you may not want to go there, except that you need to prepare your child and figure out how to do that in a very low key way that doesn't highlight it as something extraordinary. It's, we're all like, I have really poor vision, but I have a million other things that I can do. And so I don't define myself by needing glasses. And I think you can do that again, very simply, matter of fact, and short.
Mhm. Okay, that's interesting because there are some families who kind of go the extreme of celebrating it and, making it a superpower and a strength even.
I think that's fine if it seems helpful. From my point of view, I would say I would emphasize other strengths. I think everybody has strengths, and we want to affirm anybody and find the things about them that are good. I'm more concerned about emphasizing too much the glories of autism because sometimes it's hard. Sometimes people have to put out huge effort to survive in very social, for example, schools. And I think we need to recognize that and not ignore how hard it can be. It doesn't mean, though, that that person doesn't have wonderful strengths in other areas. So my bias is to not make autism the superpower, find something else. The child's persistence or curiosity or sense of humor or thoughtfulness or skills in a certain area. And then the autism is, and it's both, it has its strengths and its weaknesses, but not focus primarily on it. But I know there are people that would disagree with me as well.
Okay, well, that's a very interesting perspective. Okay, Kathy, let's talk about the evolution of the autism diagnosis because there have been changes across the DSM editions from multiple subtypes to now this bigger umbrella. Can you talk about the kind of benefits and limitations and what we've gained, what we might have lost when the diagnostic categories merged?
Yes, I think the diagnostic categories lurch along for years as we try to figure out what would be most helpful. I also think people have to remember that DSM is a publication of the American Psychiatric Association and is what people use for billing in order to get reimbursed. And so that's why it's there. There's also ICD-11, which is the World Health Organization, all diseases, also, though, primarily made by physicians, some of whom see autistic people and some of whom don't. And those are also used for billing codes. So people do use them in research, but I think everyone is aware that autism is such a heterogeneous condition that to say that someone has autism is just a beginning in trying to understand what their strengths are, what is hard for them. I think we went from thinking autism was part of schizophrenia, which it is not, just because I think people didn't understand autistic kids and realized something was different. But we know for a variety of reasons that autism is not schizophrenia. So that was the first step. Then there was the emphasis on autism as a childhood disease, where only children were getting diagnosed and nobody even was thinking about what happens as they get older, or also someone who didn't get diagnosed as a child but has autism. I think we've then moved to more of a lifespan. I also think that originally the definition of autism was quite extreme and talked about someone who was really aloof and often didn't talk at all, or all their language was different. And now I think we have a much better sense that autism can be a diminution, something that's harder for people to do, which they can sometimes accomplish eventually, but with more effort and support. Then I think people tried to break autism into subtypes. The problem there was the subtypes were not reliable. They weren't reliable across different clinicians. I mean, a typical phenomenon was a child went to a pediatrician and the pediatrician would say, "You have PDD-NOS because I don't want to say autism. You're too little and I've only seen you for 15 minutes." Then the child would get a longer diagnosis and they would be a little bit older. So someone would say, "Oh, you have autism." Then the child would turn out to be quite bright and be able to talk. And someone would say, "Oh, no, I think you have Asperger's syndrome." Then you would get to adulthood and the adult would need help in terms of, say, support in getting a job. And there's no help for Asperger's. So they would get autism again. We actually did a study where we compared across 12 sites around the United States who are doing the same exact assessment for a genetic study. And then the senior clinician made a diagnosis. And we found out that the best predictor of whether their child would get PDD-NOS, autism, or Asperger's was where the child was seen, not the characteristic of the child. So that was the reason why we decided to abolish all these subtypes. And it's just complicated because people sometimes wanted PDD-NOS because it sounded better.
Can you clarify? Sorry, Catherine. What is PD?
PDD-NOS was pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified.
Thank
So
you.
it meant you didn't quite reach criteria for autism. So sometimes people wanted that because it sounded milder. It didn't. And so we would see families who would say, the pediatrician said, my child doesn't have autism. He has PDD-NOS. And then Asperger's, which was used for people who had more language, theoretically, who didn't meet criteria for autism. But in fact, many, many people who had Asperger's also met criteria for autism. It's just that they were more skilled in expressive language and sometimes were diagnosed later. So it was just so confusing and used so intermittently across states and across different clinicians that we felt like this was really wrong. And that was the logic of trying to have just one category of autism and then specifiers where you could say this is a person with autism who has a language delay, or this is a person with autism who has an intellectual disability. It also allowed us to diagnose somebody, for example, who had Down syndrome and autism, or who had ADHD and autism, which you couldn't do before. But I think that has backfired a little bit because people are saying, wait a minute, this is such a huge area and we're not paying adequate attention to the parents of profoundly autistic kids have been saying, wait a minute, our kids are getting left out because now there are so many more people who have autism, don't have intellectual disability, that people forget about the kids who are really severely affected. So that's been one argument. And then I think the other argument has been, well, what about people who have much milder issues? And should they get some other category? And at least from my perspective, I think these are reasonable questions. The problem is what happens to the middle. There are a lot of people that are not profoundly autistic, but are not, you know, Bill Gates or someone who is highly functional and mildly affected by some symptoms of autism. And what happens to them? And I worry that that's going to get lost if we just break off the tips of autism. But I don't know.
Is there a way to have 3? Or are you getting into subtypes again?
Yeah, and who is gonna be in the middle is really negotiable. Because, for
Mm.
example, most people with autism who have intellectual disabilities, even mild intellectual disabilities, do need pretty significant support. The chances of them being financially independent are very slim, but they can work if you have support, if you help them find a job. They can live some can live independently, some can't, depending on other issues. And so what happens to them if we break this off? Because there's such variation there. And the problem there is that there are specifiers. I mean, there are ways that you can clarify this. I feel like we can do quite a good job with parents of helping them understand this is hard for your child, this is not. What are we going to do next? But in terms of classifications that might get somebody, for example, Social Security, I really worry about it. We don't want people to lose support or services. That's my big fear.
Right, right. That makes sense. So is it kind of just being left as is for now until there's another solution?
I don't know. I mean, I think again, these are not decisions made by me. They're decisions made by a group of psychiatrists, mostly who are not in autism. And then I think they're collecting information. So various groups are lobbying very loudly for whatever they think might help their group most. So people should let the APA know, the American Psychiatric Association, if you have strong feelings about it, because they've said they're going to listen, but it's not clear what's going to happen.
Okay. Well, it's good to know that at least they're open.
Yep.
Thanks for tuning in to Autism Knows No Borders. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and come back next Thursday for part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Kathy Lord, where she shares findings from her groundbreaking longitudinal study. Thanks for listening. Take care.